You know, when I was a little kid, what my dad would do as a physical geographer at a community college, he would take us on field trips. The little kids on a field trip. Here we go again, another field trip. Well, we loved it because we learned about things like bergschrunds at the head of a glacier. We learned about roches montagnaises. We learned about braided streams, all those types of physical processes that happen in the landscape. And we absolutely loved it. As a cultural geographer and a high school teacher now, what I've done is I've tried to incorporate the idea of a human imprint onto that physical world. So I got the great background, but I think what we need to make sure we understand is as we look at the field of geography, what we're doing is we're looking at the physical and we're looking at the cultural. And what's important there is as we merge those two together, there's this kind of larger umbrella that we call landscape investigation. And we get to attend to both of these things in order to be able to understand the world we live in and for students to understand the world they live in. Without this, we can't do this, but without this, this doesn't make sense. So we merge the cultural and physical together. Okay. Hi, my name is Mike Papritz. I'm a high school social studies teacher, geography teacher in the Kent School District. I teach AP Human Geography, and I teach it because of my love for geography. So this is where this information comes from. For the longest time, around 18, 20 years now, I've been involved in the need to get students outside the four walls. The four walls give us an idea of how to be able to start the curriculum, but getting them outside the four walls and getting them into the real world is really what geography is all about. So over time, I helped develop a process called landscape investigation. It's a system where we get kids into the outdoors, not necessarily to take field trips, but more so to be able to get them in the field to do research, inquiry research. That's what landscape investigation is. It's got three major processes, which include spatial inquiry, connective inquiry, and analytical inquiry. I'm going to talk about the two first ones in length, and then we'll talk about the analytical inquiry in a minor sense. So the idea here is to get kids in the field, or adults, educators, to be able to teach kids how to do this work. Part of what we have to do is understand the basic notion of geography, and that is the sense that we live in a spatial world. Things are organized spatially. That is to say, they're organized where one thing impacts another thing. Buildings being built in this area impact other facilities that are in other areas. And so if we look at the human-built world, what we see is that there are patterns that developed. This is the spatial inquiry that we want kids to understand. Once they understand that inquiry, then what they have a chance to do is understand how our built environment interacts with our natural world. That's the essence of landscape investigation. So our idea is to get out into the field and to be able to start looking into the field with a different lens. A different lens means that instead of going into a place like Tacoma or Seattle to look at the urban center just because it's there, we look at it from a sense that how are where the buildings constructed, and the reason why the businesses are where they are, why certain businesses are located where they are, and you start to build what we call a base map, an understanding of a particular location in order to build information and layer information to be able to understand it better. We go through this process so that we have kids understand the relevance of their world. So when it's funny because when we talk about geography, oftentimes we don't really know what it is. We know that it's capitals and it's states and it's things like that. That's a very small portion of geography. The interactive portion of geography is when we can get the kids out looking at the field, however we do it. Part of what we then do is once we get them out in the field, we do a thing called connective inquiry. And so as we go out in the field, as we start observing something like an urban center or a natural setting, what we're trying to do is make the connections from disciplines through the kind of umbrella of geography. So we can do math skills out in the area that connect with environmental issues that may be going on in the same area, that connect with language things that we're doing, and it's all under this umbrella, this spatial umbrella we call geography. As we go forth and do a landscape investigation, the idea then is for kids to get out in the field and to do this work, to look at historical markers, to interview individuals that have some sort of stake in that community. I remember one time we were in La Conner, and we were doing a landscape investigation, and it was so fun because it's not a very big town if you know where La Conner is, up in the Skagit Valley area. But what happened was that the kids really got into understanding their own history of their town, even though they've lived there for so long. So what happens is it's an amazing process where kids start to understand why things are where they are, that spatial sense, and they understand it through looking at this connective inquiry. Another time I was fortunate enough to go to Peru a few times, and I actually did a landscape investigation with teachers down there. And we ended up finding out that there's this, up in 18,000 feet in the Andes, there was water well systems that were developed and actually taken from the east side of the mountains over to the west side of the mountains because they wanted to drain the water more to the west side. And that really hadn't been discussed yet, but as we did this process of landscape investigation and this connective inquiry, we came to understand, wow, look, there's this huge thing that happened hundreds of years ago for the Incas that ended up being a major marker as to where the population centers would go because of where the water started flowing and the manipulation of them moving the water. That's landscape investigation. It's a pretty cool thing. Last part is analytical inquiry. It really has to do with once you go and do your ground truthing, you do all your activities in the field, then you go back and you start to use GPS, GIS, to be able to layer information. And in essence, this analytical inquiry brings us to a point where we'd like to do some sort of call to action. So what are we doing all this stuff for? I remember one time I was listening to a GIS high school teacher from Fairfax County, Virginia, and she said, look, I want the kids to do something with their school board, do something with their community board, whatever. And through GIS, they learned that there was a lot of deer kills in a certain area. So with their information, after doing their connective inquiry, they went to the city planning commission and said, hey, look, here's our map, here's what's going on where all the deer kills are. Because we have this empirical information, shouldn't we go ahead and put some warning signs up? And sure enough, they were allowed to do that. So it's a small piece of what you could do, but this is really to get kids to understand a deep sense of their community through geography. The value that it has is that kids are starting to make connections with other disciplines. They're starting to understand that the sense of inquiry is an important process. You just don't open a textbook and answer the questions. What you do is you go out into the real world and make this inquiry. It's also important for the community because what happens is we've got citizens coming of age, when they turn 18, that actually can think about the issues in our world. Environmental issues, economic issues, different issues because they can now use a different lens to be able to look through the world. When we developed landscape investigation, what we did was we tried to figure out an easy way to think about spatial inquiry. What we came up with is the idea of seeing the landscape. Seeing spelled S-E-E-H-I-N-G. And the four letters S-E-E-H stand for spatial, ecological, economic, and historic. What happens is all those four ideas get wrapped around in a spatial inquiry type of activity. The spatial meaning the dimensions on landscape that are human built and organized different ways. Okay? The ecological has to do with our interaction with the physical world or the natural world and what ramifications happen that way. Economic has to do with everything we do in our lives. Virtually everything we do has economic both impact and economic value, okay? Or sometimes the lack thereof. So we have to incorporate the idea of the economics portion of it. And in historical, we make historical footprints every single day. And oftentimes those lead to different spatial dimensions on the landscape too. Think about World War II, think about Civil War. We have different spatial features that happen because of the historical interaction with our physical world again. That's what spatial inquiry does. Seeing the landscape. S-E-E-H-I-N-G. Have fun.